Hello, I'm Sue Stockdale, and welcome to episode 146 of the Access to Inspiration podcast, where we bring you conversations with inspiring people who encourage us to think differently and step outside our comfort zones. Today, we're diving into the theme of navigating in the unknown, whether that's in careers, personal growth, or leadership. Joining me is Rosemary Hoskins, a learning and development expert with a fascinating journey of embracing change and stepping into new opportunities. We'll explore how critical thinking, adaptability, and learning from peers can help us thrive in uncertain times. You can read a transcription of this episode as you listen on our website at accesstoinspiration.org. Welcome to the podcast, Rosemary. It's lovely to speak to you today.
Thank you, Sue.
The focus for our conversation today is about building skills to navigate the unknown. And it strikes me that certainly my age group, when we started out our careers, for many people, there was one job for life, or their career path seemed very clearly mapped out for them. Today, that's so different. And that's why I want to focus on this subject with you, to help our listener think about how they navigate that unknown in their work and their lives. What was it like for you when you were starting out in your career?
I graduated straight into a recession. So I had to do something a bit non-standard immediately. After I graduated, I'd studied science and I wanted to not drop the languages. I went and lived in Belgium for a year to pick up French. And I took this job as a graduate that usually linguists do in their gap year. So I was teaching English in schools, in the Belgian school system. And I was looking for a proper job and there were no proper jobs. And the new graduate jobs were going to people with work history because there was a recession. I think I must have applied to about 3 or 4 jobs in the whole year that looked possible. There just weren't openings. And so when I came back to the UK, I started doing voluntary work for a charity because there was nothing else to do. So I might as well do something purposeful. And I got us a free office in a business centre. And all the people in the business centre were very interested in this environmental charity that I was leading and what was happening with the environment at that stage. And I'd studied ecology. And I mean, sometimes I think from kindness and supportiveness, but sometimes from genuine commercial drivers as well. Some of them asked me to do bits of work for them. And so I ended up working for myself with the portfolio of the charity and commercial clients. And that slowly built. So the expectation was that you would go into a standard role. You might go into one of those roles in a blue chip company where you rotated around every 6 months and got a taste of everything. I hit something unexpected right at the beginning. And I do remember people saying to me, oh, it's so brave of you to start your own business. But the risk wasn't that much, actually, because the choice was start your own business, carry on volunteering, be unemployed. You know, there weren't that many great choices at the time.
So in the world of learning, which has been quite a large proportion of your career in helping organisations to equip their workforce for the future, what do you think these days are the skills that people need in the workplace to be able to navigate into the unknown in their career and in their work?
I don't think you're going to be surprised to hear things like critical thinking and the ability to learn. So learning how to learn. Curiosity is talked about quite a lot. I think that's quite hard to define. But certainly critical thinking, not taking everything at face value, thinking about whether you believe what you've been told and whether there are other options. I don't know if it's a skill, but it's about psychological safety. So sometimes it's the conditions that you're in, because that allows you to do something braver or riskier, perceived to be riskier. Of course, there's risks in not doing the brave things as well, if you just do what you always did.
As you're talking about critical thinking there, Rosemary, I'm imagining an employee questioning their boss to really just check out the validity of what they've been asked to do or why they're doing it. Sometimes bosses don't like that sort of thing.
Well, it's not being critical. It's being thinking critically. It doesn't mean voicing criticism necessarily. So critical thinking might enable you to think that's one route we could do, and there are other things that we could do. You might provide insight into the other option quietly as your response to the first request. I mean, in an ideal situation, you do challenge, you say, are you sure you really want me to do that? Or shall I do this as well? Or I'd be keen to do this as well, to include it.
And I think that's an important distinction. It leads me on to think about how AI, artificial intelligence, is coming into every workplace these days. How does AI shape that unknown for people? Because it's quite easy, isn't it, to just rely on what AI tells us and not to do the critical thinking. How should we encourage people to think more broadly than just the information it's providing to them?
Well, there's that, of course, is not believing everything you hear because it's an average of everything it's heard, right? I mean, of course, it will get better. That's not just a question of AI. That's a question of the internet and social media and so on. And so it comes back to critical thinking and a little bit of actually having information there. For instance, there are lots of learning myths out on the internet. And so any large learning model will repeat those back if you're not careful. It's not just about that. It's not just about not believing everything you're told, but also thinking about the opportunities that, for instance, language models or other forms of AI might offer to help us achieve whatever it is what we want to achieve. So it's another tool in the box. It's very good if you can give it a whole load of data and ask it to pull out themes that where you owe the data. That's interesting, but that's partly because you're in control of the data set it's based on.
I'm hearing this discernment that's an important part of us being able to work in uncertainty to get some clarity. Often a phrase that's used these days is working in the grey. So it's not just a yes, no answer. And often I find in coaching conversations with leaders that that's what they find uncomfortable, is when there is no clarity and no one answer, one route for them to take. How would you define working in the grey? What does it mean to you, Rosemary?
Well, I think you're right. There's often seeming clarity. The high level goal is very loudly expressed with certainty from somebody, from a leader, and you're expected to achieve that high level thing, but there's no route map. And actually, sometimes when you start to probe, there's no real definition of what that high level goal is, or how you would measure success. And I think working in that situation, one of the things you can do is you set out your definitions and socialize them, you test them, say, is this what you want? Is this how we would measure success? It's exciting as well, because although it can be very unclear what you're supposed to achieve when you're supposed to achieve it, really, make our people better at something is a very clear demand, but the route there is tricky. But it does allow you to create your own opportunities, create your own map, share that map, get that signed off, and create something different perhaps than has happened before.
So just keeping focused on your role within the learning space, Rosemary, when you're helping to support the organisation in looking at longer term goals, which may not be clear, how are you then working out what the learning and development needs will be to support that?
There's all sorts of ways the function L&D can help with that. And there is something about enabling people to understand how they do learn at work. People often think about education, formal learning, as workplace learning. You go to a workshop, you do something online that's a course, you get a certificate, and there's lots of focus on that. But it's only about 10% of how we learn at work. The other 90% is about roughly 20% learning from other people, from mentoring, or from sitting next to somebody and seeing what they're doing differently to you. And about 70% is from doing things yourselves, trying them. And being aware of that is a really good starting point, right? So although it's very tangible, the 10%, the formal learning, and there's a lot of focus on it, the other things are very, very important, much more important. Enabling people to realize that they learn things by doing them themselves or working alongside somebody a bit more expert is probably one of the bigger enablers, I would have thought.
So this is a lovely segue into just reflecting back on your own career journey, Rosemary. As you look back, what have been the key turning points of learning for you?
I'm definitely a learning by doing person, but partly because for the first 20 years, I worked on my own, essentially. I had a great formal education, but then formal learning as part of my workplace wasn't a thing. I was learning it by doing it or learning from what colleagues or clients said to me or asked me for. We like this, but could you do more of this? I think that the things that you learn of it, you can do it. And the risk is usually worth it. And if you collaborate with people and you're authentic and you ask them about how you're doing them, both personally and in the work product, they give you the direction you need.
So let me throw a curveball into our conversation, Rosemary, because I understand one of the things that you took a leap of faith on in your lifetime was to bring back a polo pony from Argentina to the UK. Now, when I heard you talk about this in our earlier conversation, I was quite surprised because it's not the sort of norm that many people would even dream of doing. So tell me the backstory about how you came to make that decision and how did that relate to learning and stepping into the unknown?
I was a little girl who wanted to ride and have a pony, and my mother was very supportive of me learning to ride, but there was no way I was having a pony. And the refrain was, a pony is for every day, including Christmas. You can't have one. And she'd grown up with horses, so she really knew that they were for every day and that she didn't want to be the person who ended up with the work. And we didn't have somewhere to put a horse or anything like that. So As an adult, I got back a bit into riding through friends and started having lessons and so on. Started to go on a few riding holidays, which you can do. You'll go away for a week and see some lovely landscape somewhere in a nicer climate. And on one of those holidays, we went to South Africa, which was amazing. And just for a little sort of fun sideline, tried polo cross, which is like lacrosse on horseback. And I really enjoyed that. And so when I came back to the UK, I looked to see if there were any polo cross or polo clubs. And it was before the internet was a really big thing, before you could just look up the websites. But eventually I did find somebody and I went down and had some lessons near London, but they kept getting cancelled because the weather was so terrible. And then I mentioned that to a friend, said, oh, it's got to the end of the polo season, which is the summer. And I've only had 3 or 4 lessons. And she said, oh, I know somebody who plays polo. And so I went in to see them and they gave my number to an Argentine polo professional who phoned me on his way to the airport back to Argentina, because polo professionals spend their summers in England and then their summers in Argentina, perpetual summer. And he said, you can come and do a polo holiday if you like. And I'd finished a big project. And so I took the opportunity and went on this holiday to play polo. And I definitely wasn't going to buy a pony. I was having a lovely time riding other people's horses, sort of turning up, riding them for an hour, giving them money in fair exchange for the service and leaving. Sometimes giving them a bit of a brush, but I didn't have any of the responsibilities. And if I was away for a week, it wasn't my problem. And then I just fell for this horse. I really liked her. And there was a rainy day where we had the opportunity to just sit and chat. And so then I ended up exploring, well, where would I keep her? Where would I play polo if I did? And polo has this very glamorous, costly image, but there's also quite a lot of more accessible or sort of family-based polo. So I got to understand a little bit about that. So I ended up paying a deposit of 50% on this horse, but on the condition that if I didn't like polo in the UK or the polo set, the chap would sell her on to somebody else and I wouldn't pay the remainder of the balance. And that 50% paid for her flight across, which was quite a usual thing. They have a charter flight full of polo ponies coming across. So the risk for him wasn't too bad either. I'm sure he wouldn't have agreed. But yeah, then lots of people I then met said, you do know that one is only the beginning. And indeed it is. And so I moved from my very small central Cambridge house to the country so that I could have the horses outside. There's a collection of semi-retired and still working horses outside the windows now.
As I'm listening to you, what's springing to my mind is the wonderful power of what if. And to fuel somebody's imagination is to take them into that space of imagining possibilities, just as you described on that rainy day where you were asking those what if questions. And that then enabled reality to become more possible than just a fantasy. And that's an important skill for people in the workplace to also have the skill of the what if.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I hadn't thought about it like that. Because obviously there was all sorts of risks, but then there were calculated risks. I had thought, what's the worst that could happen? I could hate the whole thing. And then what will we do? The chap would take the horse on. In the same way, I built my own house, and that's a fairly risky enterprise. And I thought, well, if the worst comes to the worst, the land will have a value. The house will have a value. I might lose some money, but I might gain some because I'll have put in sweat equity. And it was really hard work, but I've got a lovely house and the worst didn't happen. But I do think the what ifs and what the worst scenarios be and what would I do in those scenarios, it helps not be stressed, right? Because you thought of what probably would be the worst situation and you have an outline approach to it.
So we've talked about calculated risks. We've talked about the what if, the exploring possibilities. We've also mentioned about having some sort of structure and plan in place. There are 3 things that have helped you, at least I'm taking away from our conversation, have helped you to step into the unknown.
Yeah, actually, I think that's right. And I can see some sort of parallels with your exploring world as well, right?
Yes, those are really important in the Arctic on expedition as well. What do you think is the risk, if there is a risk? Is there a downside to being comfortable in the unknown and in the grey?
I think you need to be conscious that other people aren't necessarily, but you can share the comfort. You can think about what the worst scenarios are and what you would do about them. That can be a group activity. It's better as a group activity because critical thinking and problem solving and decision making all improve if you've got different viewpoints feeding into that different data point. And some people think that it can be perceived that you're foolhardy because you're doing something that's non-standard. But then if you did what you always do, you'll get what you always got. And that in a very changing world might not be a wise decision either.
And if you're enjoying this episode, we now have more than 140 episodes, ranging from business and sports to the arts and social change, all organised into categories on our website, which makes it much easier for you to find them. Just hop on over to accesstoinspiration.org to discover them all. Now back to Rosemary. One point I wanted to pick up on, if we take the world of leaders, often it's very lonely at the top. No matter what size of organisation you're in, the more senior you get, the fewer chances there is to get feedback and input. And it can be quite a lonely place. So how would you encourage leaders to get input from others?
I think there are two things there. If you're a leader, that implies that you have a team, and your team may have really important information because they're actually executing some of the stuff that you're not into the detail of. So there's that whole thing about being inclusive, taking some deliberate moves when you're asking for input to make sure that everybody gets their chance to do it. There's some acknowledged ways that you don't get groupthink accidentally. But the other thing I see huge value in from a point of view of L&D is peer-to-peer coaching and peer-to-peer support groups. And sometimes in big organizations, you can do that with people who are in a different vertical in the organization. So they really are detached from your problem, but they've got an exactly parallel problem. And you hear those conversations, and the empathy and the authenticity is amazing, actually. And people really make themselves quite vulnerable in those conversations. And small groups where it's understood that there's confidentiality and support can be a really powerful thing, I think, because partly, as you say, it helps make it feel less lonely, but other people have different experiences that they can bring.
What we're saying here is that there's power in the togetherness, that leaders don't have to have all the answers, but they do need to know what questions to ask and who to ask them of, if whether it's their peers or their team.
And sometimes they're senior stakeholders, right? I mean, most leaders still have somebody who leads them numerically. And so that checking in about this is the approach I'm planning, this is how I'm going to measure success. Are you on the same page as me? But yes, I do think there's that, the companionship in the consultation and the comfort of knowing that you have the data of what other people have said or errors in your perception that they might have pointed out.
So as we've been going in our conversation, we've flitted from the workplace and thinking about learning in the workplace. And then we've also learned about your personal experiences and some of the ways that you've stepped into the unknown and tried out new things and experimented for yourself. So as your career journey continues on now, how do you look at the unknown today and think about the future?
I find it quite exciting. So I'm wrapping up my big corporate role and I'm going to go back to being a freelancer working in advisory. And it plays on some of the companionship you talked about. I've got this amazing network of really lovely people who are doing interesting work. And I'm really looking forward to working with some of them to solve their problems and bring an extra point of view to their deliberations and their work. Yeah, so I found that quite exciting.
So it seems to me that you're predisposed to being optimistic than looking for the things that might go wrong.
Yes, and I do have experience. So I worked for myself for 20 years. And when I started out, there wasn't much to risk because I was a young graduate and there weren't many options. And over time, I found that the inflow of work waxed and waned, but usually you had a little bit more than you could balance rather than a little bit less than you could work with. And then, of course, I got to a point where all my clients got abolished and that wasn't the situation. And then you have to adjust course. My experience is that there is work for people who are ready to do it. That sounds as if I'm saying, everybody should get on their bike and get a job. But in a situation where there's a lot of change, that does create uncertainties in the economy. That does create opportunities for the agile, for the people who are flexible and available. And it probably creates more opportunities for partners like me than for permanent roles. I mean, I'm not ruling out taking a permanent role at some point. If a great job comes along, there's real advantages to being on side with longevity and being able to see plans through over the long term. But there will be opportunities in the uncertain economy now that are probably better suited to somebody who is available for a project at a time.
And if we were thinking about Rosemary and her skill set, what are the things that really you're adding value to an organisation with?
I think what I bring is a very broad view of what could be possible. So I'm always about what you're trying to achieve and not necessarily about how you achieve it. I don't have a preconceived way of getting to that end goal. And I'm very data oriented. I want the evidence. I want to know how I'm going to measure success. in a meaningful way, because there's lots of measures of success that I don't think are necessarily valid. Bit of creativity. I'm quite good at inventing new ways to do things. I was creating a professional skills academy for AstraZeneca. So I was hired into a new role as a professional skills lead, and there hadn't been one at global level before. So each business unit was doing their own thing, responding to their own needs, going externally and hiring lovely vendors to help them do different interventions. But there was obviously a level of duplication there and potentially divergence as well, people taking different approaches, different frameworks to what should be shared skills. And I was sitting in a centre of excellence where we were trying to get the efficiency and the benefits of taking one approach where it makes sense for everybody in a very big organisation. And it ties back a little bit to what I said to you about working in the grey, because I was asked to create Professional Skills Academy. Very clear ask, but nobody really knew exactly what they meant by that. So I defined what professional skills meant, circulated my definition, nobody objected, socialized it, tested it a bit, started using that definition, created a list of the professional skills that we would build capability in, consulted, people asked about some additional ones, added those into the mix, or said, no, they don't fit the definition, they won't be in the mix, but we hear you and we'll pass on that need to people who might deal with it. Looked at how we might build the capability at scale. And we had a new learning experience platform, so coached a team into creating content for that platform and not just lifting and shifting from prior content. We've done education online first because that's the expectation. It's almost like a hygiene factor, but we want to now move into experience and exposure because those are really how people learn. So you have your basic threads, started to build out in those areas, added in a whole new opportunity for people to learn foreign language skills, which sit in professional skills, but a little bit different from resilience or project management or something like that. And that's been very popular as well. The take up has been impressive. Yes, so had a plan, socialized it, set out the priorities, implemented the priorities, kept moving. And now it's quite clear what a professional skills academy looks like. And I suppose if somebody asked me to do that again, I might be inclined to say, well, I've done this before. Were you thinking of this? And so it might take less time to think about. But yes, that's a very good example of where it was really clear what I was being asked to do, but it wasn't really clear what that meant and how you would measure it.
And given that you have now achieved that outcome, what part of that process are you most proud of?
At the same time, we introduced a way of measuring impact, learning impact, which sat in a different area that I was responsible for, learning content strategy. And the way that we're measuring impact is asking people how strongly they agree with the statement that they're going to be able to apply learning from the education intervention or from the experience in their work. And if they agree with that, how strongly they agree that it's going to contribute to business performance. So directly tying learning to changing the way that you work to the benefit of your organization. So not did you like it, would you recommend it to your friends, but something more stringent about impact. And we ask people to tell us stories about that, unlimited amount of text to tell us why they agree with the statement so that we can see what's happening in the patterns. And quite early, somebody said that they had completed our resilience content and that they were in a really bad place at work when they did it. They were on a performance improvement plan and they were thinking about leaving the organization. In their role, they would have been a huge loss to the organization and been expensive and slow to replace. And she said this on record internally on one of our promotional videos, that the content about reframing enabled her to change things around and that she got her performance back up and she's staying and she's happy in her organization and vulnerable and authentic enough to share that story within the organization, which is amazing. And it's those personal stories that make it very real. We built the Professional Skills Academy. Our managers were happy. We had data to show that people were applying their learning. But that story about somebody staying in the organization and all of the benefits to her personally and the benefits to the organization, those sorts of stories, they're the things that make your heart sing.
It's such a lovely illustration of the power of storytelling and partly why we launched this Access to Inspiration podcast 5 years ago now, in that to hear people's stories to inspire others and see the impact that that can have. So if you were to give advice to our listener based on your experience of learning and stepping into the unknown and making an impact as well, being purpose-led, what advice would you give to somebody in the workplace?
you can do it. And small steps. It depends what somebody is trying to do and how different it is from what they're being asked to do, I suppose. Every little bit counts. You can take a step in a general direction, and especially in a big corporate workplace. There's often opportunities to do things voluntarily in addition to your formal role. So you're not asking for time away from your role. You're just saying, I could help with that. And it's a really good opportunity to learn in that 90%, learning from other people and learning from doing things. You can fulfill your purpose. You might be interested in changing the world from an environmental point of view, but you might make a contribution in reduced energy and waste. Everybody has different ways that they're suited to achieve their purpose.
And for those that are working in the grey, what would you say to them that might make them more comfortable to work in the grey?
Make a plan, get the plan agreed, because that gives you a framework in the uncertainty. And you don't have to necessarily know all of the details of all of the steps you're going to take, but you need a sort of a general framework.
So out of the uncertainty, a degree of certainty can come by having at least a structure or a plan to get going.
Indeed, and you can create that, right? And so you can put steps in that you know you can achieve, you and your colleagues.
Well, it's been really interesting having this conversation, Rosemary. I wish you well in whatever the next step of your journey is. And thank you for your time today. If people want to find out more about you, how might they be able to connect with you?
I think the most straightforward way is by LinkedIn.
Lovely. Well, we'll put a link to that in our show notes and people can follow up with you then.
Thank you. It's very thought-provoking.
Well, I hope you enjoyed what Rosemary had to say. It really made me think. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe and share this episode with others or leave us a review. It really helps more people discover inspiring stories like Rosemary's. I'll be back again speaking to an ocean rower, Zara Loughlin, about her experience of rowing across the Atlantic. I hope you can join us then.